It was just another quiet afternoon when Karen, the notorious HOA officer, showed up at my door with her usual haughty attitude. Her tone was already condescending before she even spoke, as if she'd been rehearsing for this moment. She handed me an official-looking notice, claiming that I had violated some obscure rule about property upkeep. It wasn't the first time Karen had made a spectacle out of the most trivial of infractions, but this time felt different. She was determined, almost smug, as though she knew something I didn't. What I couldn't have predicted was that this encounter would turn into something far more explosive than just a petty HOA dispute. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. The moment she opened her mouth, I could tell her plans were bigger than just issuing a fine. She wanted me gone, evicted from my own home, something I had worked tirelessly for years to secure. But little did she know, this wasn't just any house, it was one part of something much larger. And as Karen pressed further, a realization began to form in the back of my mind. She wasn't just trying to kick me out, she had no clue that I owned not only the house she was targeting but the entire neighborhood she was so eager to control. The HOA had made a powerful enemy that day, one who would not back down easily. Karen was about to find out just how far my influence reached, and the consequences of underestimating me would soon become apparent. As Karen's presence lingered at my doorstep, her voice continued to drip with disdain, her words more of an ultimatum than a simple request. She spoke about zoning laws, noise complaints, and various fabricated issues that supposedly required immediate action. Her tone was an odd mixture of authority and arrogance, as if she was in the middle of a victory lap, unaware that her words were having the opposite effect. She was used to pushing people around, expecting them to comply without question, but I wasn't like the others in the neighborhood. I had always stayed out of the petty HOA drama, choosing instead to focus on my own life and business. But the moment she stepped onto my property with that condescending air, something inside me snapped. I wasn't just fighting for my own home now, I was ready to defend my entire community. The truth was, I owned far more than the small corner of the neighborhood Karen was trying to control. Over the years, I had quietly bought up the surrounding homes, one by one, making strategic purchases that ensured I had significant influence over the entire area. It was a long-term plan, one that few people knew about, least of all Karen. She had no idea that the house she was targeting was just the tip of the iceberg. If she thought she could push me out so easily, she was gravely mistaken. The HOA had always overstepped its bounds, but now, with me at the center, things were about to change. Karen's attempts to intimidate me only fueled my resolve. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't the victim here, I was the one in control. I had built something much larger than she could ever imagine, and the moment she decided to challenge me, she sealed her fate. As I stood there, listening to her demand that I vacate the premises, I couldn't help but smile inwardly. I had a few tricks up my sleeve, and Karen had just walked right into the trap I had set, unknowingly. She had no idea that the very neighborhood she thought she could dominate was already mine in a much deeper, more permanent way. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that her arrogance would be her undoing. While she prattled on about regulations and threats, I started to map out my next move, a calculated response that would make her realize the depth of her mistake. If Karen thought she could win this battle, she had another thing coming. She was up against more than just a homeowner, she was up against someone with the power to reshape the entire HOA structure, to rewrite the rules that had long been used to bully residents into submission. But Karen was too blinded by her small-time authority to see the bigger picture. She kept pushing, convinced she had the upper hand, but in reality, she was digging herself deeper into a hole she would never be able to climb out of. What Karen didn't know, and what she was about to learn the hard way, was that her attempts to evict me were nothing more than a prelude to a much larger confrontation, a confrontation that would not only change her life but the lives of every member of the HOA who had ever crossed the line with me. As the tension between us escalated, I could feel the weight of the situation shift. This wasn't just a battle for my home, it was a battle for control of the entire neighborhood. And I wasn't about to let Karen, or anyone else, take that away from me. As Karen's words continued to echo in the air, I began to assess the situation with a clear, calculating mind. She had made a critical mistake, one that she wouldn't be able to undo. She thought she could throw her weight around, assuming that I, like most others, would simply bow to the power of the HOA. What she didn't realize was that her act of aggression had ignited something far beyond a mere disagreement. This wasn't about petty rules or noise complaints anymore. This was a power struggle, one where the odds were stacked firmly in my favor. The more she pressed, the more her arrogance clouded her judgment. I had been laying the groundwork for years, quietly acquiring properties, building an empire right under the noses of the HOA members. At first, it had been about securing my own home, ensuring a safe haven for my family. But as time passed, I saw opportunities, ways to extend my influence, ways to take back control from an organization that had grown too big for its own good. What Karen had failed to understand was that when she came after me, she wasn't just targeting an individual homeowner. She was challenging someone with an intricate web of ownership that stretched far beyond her understanding. I wasn't the helpless homeowner she thought I was the one who had the leverage, and soon enough, she would see that firsthand. Her smug attitude began to wear thin as I listened to her, but I kept my composure, knowing that any reaction from me would play directly into her hands. She was looking for a fight, and I wasn't about to give her one on her terms. Instead, I began to think about how I could flip the script. What would it take to make her see the truth? To make her realize that she had no idea what she had just gotten herself into? I had the entire neighborhood in my grasp, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The HOA had long been a source of tension, constantly overstepping its bounds, imposing rules that many of the residents found ridiculous. But now, with my quietly amassed control, I had the ability to challenge their authority in a way they would never expect. Karen thought she was the one holding the cards, but she had no idea that I had already stacked the deck in my favor. The moment she walked into my life with her demands, she had unknowingly triggered a chain reaction that would ultimately turn the tables. I could feel the momentum building, the power slowly shifting in my direction as I calculated my next steps. This was no longer just about a single eviction, it was about rewriting the entire narrative. It was about restoring balance, about making sure the HOA knew that they couldn't trample over people without consequences. Karen had just unwittingly triggered the first domino in a much larger sequence, one that would reverberate through the entire community and shake the very foundations of the HOA's control. I knew that this wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that I was ready. Karen had made a critical mistake in thinking that she could bully me into submission. What she didn't know was that she had just walked into a battle she could never win. The more she pressed, the more the truth became clear: this was no longer a battle for a single house. It was a battle for the future of the entire neighborhood, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. I watched as she stood there, still holding the notice, her expression one of impatience mixed with entitlement. It was almost laughable how little she understood about the situation. But there was no turning back now. The stage had been set, and all I had to do was act. I knew I had the power to fight back, but I also knew that the best way to win this battle was with strategy, not brute force. Karen's overconfidence would be her downfall, and when the dust settled, would be the one standing tall, not her. I took a deep breath, knowing that the next move would change everything. This wasn't just a fight for my home anymore. It was a fight for the entire neighborhood, for control, and for a future where the HOA no longer had the power to dictate how we lived. And Karen, for all her bluster, was about to learn that she had just picked a fight with the wrong person. I wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The realization that Karen had unknowingly walked into something far bigger than she could comprehend began to settle in. The more she spoke, the more her grip on the situation seemed to slip. Every word she uttered was a thread that unraveled the illusion of control she thought she had over the neighborhood. Karen had always relied on the HOA's collective power to get her way, residents around and intimidate them into compliance. But she had never encountered anyone who had the kind of influence I wielded, quietly, over the years. With every passing moment, it became clearer that she had no idea who she was up against. She might have thought I was just a homeowner like all the others, someone who would simply roll over at the first sign of authority. But I wasn't like the others. I wasn't simply protecting a piece of land, I was holding the keys to a much larger kingdom. The neighborhood, for all its quaint charm, was part of something that was more than just a group of houses in a row. It was a carefully cultivated network of properties, each one a stepping stone toward a broader vision. As I stood there, listening to her go on about violations and consequences, I realized how easily she had underestimated me. Karen had no idea that the very rules she was trying to enforce were rules that I had the power to rewrite. The idea of eviction, the one that seemed so final and so powerful in her mind, was laughable to me. She had no understanding of the web of ownership I had woven over the years, quietly acquiring property after property. When I first began purchasing homes, I did so discreetly, careful not to draw attention to my growing influence. I wanted to be in control, but I also wanted to remain under the radar. Karen and the rest of the HOA had no reason to suspect that I wasn't just another homeowner with complaints, just another face in the crowd. But the truth was far more complex. I was far more powerful than anyone knew. The moment Karen walked into my life with her demands, she unknowingly triggered a series of events that would dismantle the very foundation of the HOA's power. There was no going back now. Every word she said felt more like a ticking clock, each second bringing us closer to the inevitable collapse of her authority. What she didn't understand was that she had already lost. The wheels were in motion, and Karen's attempts to bully me into submission were only speeding up her downfall. As she stood there, still holding that notice with her self-assured expression, I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. The uncertainty that most people would have felt in the face of such an absurd situation was absent in me. I had already envisioned this moment, already planned for it, and I knew exactly what needed to be done. The time for waiting was over. I didn't need to raise my voice or make threats. I simply needed to show Karen the truth, that she had no power here, and that her attempts to intimidate me were nothing more than empty gestures. Karen's lack of awareness about my position was exactly what gave me the upper hand. She assumed that the HOA's power was absolute, that the rules they enforced could not be challenged. But she had no idea that I had been building my own quiet revolution, one that would not only end her reign of terror but change the very structure of the HOA itself. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every person in this neighborhood who had been bullied, intimidated, or forced into compliance by the HOA's unreasonable rules. Karen was just a pawn in a larger game, and the real battle was for the residents who had been powerless for so long. I had spent years laying the foundation for this moment, and now it was time to act. With every house I purchased, with every strategic move I made, I had been positioning myself for a moment like this. I wasn't just fighting for my own home. I was fighting for the freedom of the entire neighborhood. The people who had lived under the thumb of the HOA would soon see a change, a shift in power that would forever alter the course of their lives. Karen might have thought she was in control, but the truth was, the moment she crossed me, she had signed her own fate. I was ready to take action, to leverage the power I had spent so many years building. And Karen? She was about to be swept away in the wake of my strategy, caught up in a storm she couldn't even see coming. The wheels of change were in motion, and there was no stopping them now. Karen's world was beginning to crack, but she wasn't the kind of person to back down easily. The arrogance that fueled her confidence was now the very thing leading her straight into a downfall she hadn't anticipated. She had built her authority on the foundation of intimidation, believing that as long as she spoke with enough authority, people would simply obey. But what she hadn't realized was that I wasn't just another homeowner under her control, I was the one who had the power to dismantle everything she thought she ruled over. As I watched her standing there, still holding that ridiculous eviction notice, I could see the moment of hesitation flicker across her face. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A shadow of doubt, a crack in the armor. She had assumed she had already won, but now, faced with someone who refused to yield, she was beginning to second-guess herself. But Karen was stubborn. She wasn't ready to admit she had lost. Instead, she doubled down, pressing forward with even more baseless accusations. She spoke of code violations, neighborhood complaints, and made vague threats about legal consequences if I didn't comply. She was grasping at straws now, hoping that if she threw enough nonsense at me, something would stick. But I wasn't fazed. I let her speak, let her pile on every ridiculous claim she could think of, all while keeping my own plans in motion. Because while Karen was wasting her breath, I was preparing to pull the rug out from under her in a way she never saw coming. I had spent years ensuring that every detail of my property holdings was airtight. Every home I purchased, every contract I signed, was done with precision. I had studied the HOA's own bylaws better than they had, understanding every loophole, every weak spot in their authority. Karen thought she had power, but she was nothing more than an enforcer of a system she didn't fully understand. And now, she was standing in front of someone who did. The moment she pushed that notice into my hands, I knew it was time to act. I took it, scanning it quickly, and almost laughed at how desperate it was. It was filled with vague legal jargon, threats of fines and penalties that had no real authority over me. She was bluffing, banking on intimidation to do the work for her. But she had underestimated who she was dealing with. I looked up at her, calm and composed, and simply said, "I'll take care of it." It was a deliberately vague response, one that gave her just enough false confidence to believe she had won, while in reality, I was already setting my counterattack into motion. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, forwarding him the notice and giving him the rundown of the situation. He was already familiar with my quiet acquisitions over the years, and he knew exactly how to handle an HOA trying to overstep their bounds. While Karen thought she was putting pressure on me, I was the one tightening the noose around her authority. My lawyer immediately filed for a legal review of the HOA's jurisdiction, knowing full well that the results would be in my favor. Then, I reached out to a few key residents in the neighborhood, the ones who had long been frustrated with Karen's rule but had never had the means to challenge her. I had something they didn't: resources, knowledge, and most importantly, leverage. I started laying the groundwork for what was about to happen next. Karen, oblivious to the storm heading her way, continued her campaign against me. More notices appeared on my doorstep, each one more desperate than the last. One accused me of violating noise ordinances, despite the fact that I had security footage proving otherwise. Another claimed my property was bringing down the neighborhood's value, a laughable accusation considering I owned half of it. She was running out of moves, but she wasn't smart enough to realize it. The final straw came when she tried to get the HOA board involved, rallying them behind her in an attempt to make this a group effort. But that was her biggest mistake. Because while she had been focusing on me, I had been working behind the scenes to ensure that her own allies would turn against her. I had gathered proof of her overreach, proof of her fabricated complaints, proof of her reckless attempts to manipulate the HOA into enforcing rules that didn't apply. And when the time came, I presented it all in a single, devastating blow. I filed a formal complaint against her, citing harassment, abuse of power, and falsification of HOA regulations. The board, already weary of her antics, had no choice but to take action. The meeting that followed was the turning point. Karen walked in with the same smug confidence she always carried, but this time, she was met with silence. The evidence spoke for itself. Every fake violation, every exaggerated complaint, every rule she had twisted to suit her own agenda, it was all laid out for everyone to see. She tried to argue, to twist the narrative in her favor, but it was too late. The board turned on her. The very people she had relied on to back her up were now distancing themselves from her as quickly as possible. And then came the final blow, the legal decision confirming that not only did the HOA have no authority over my property, but that I, as the majority owner in the neighborhood, had the ability to vote on the future of the HOA itself. Karen's face went pale as the realization hit her. She hadn't just lost this battle, she had lost everything. The power she had clung to for so long was gone in an instant. The board, desperate to save face, immediately moved to strip her of her position, citing her reckless behavior as grounds for dismissal. And just like that, Karen was no longer the queen of the neighborhood. She was just another resident, powerless and humiliated, watching as everything she had built crumbled around her. I didn't have to say a word as she stormed out of the meeting, her reputation in ruins. The HOA, once a tool of control, was now being reshaped into something far different, something that actually served the community instead of ruling over it. As I walked away that evening, I took one last look at Karen's house, the same house where she had spent years looking down on everyone else. Now, she was just another face in the crowd, another name on a list of homeowners with no special privileges. The neighborhood was finally free from her grasp. And as for me? I had secured my place, not just as a homeowner, but as the one who had ultimately rewritten the rules of the game. Karen had tried to evict me from my own home, not realizing that I had already claimed something far greater. And now, she was left with nothing. Karen had lost her position, but she wasn't the type to disappear quietly. Her desperation, once hidden behind the thin veil of authority, now boiled over in a way that made her more dangerous than ever. She had spent years ruling over the neighborhood, bending people to her will, and now, stripped of her title and humiliated in front of the very people she had once commanded, she was unraveling. The whispers had already begun. Residents who had once feared her now spoke openly about their resentment, recounting the years of fines, arbitrary rules, and underhanded tactics she had used to keep them in line. But Karen wasn't done. She wasn't the type to accept defeat, not when she had spent so long at the top. At first, it was petty. A few of my mail deliveries mysteriously went missing. The HOA office, now under new management, received anonymous complaints about my property, each one more ridiculous than the last, claims that my yard was unkempt, that my house was a safety hazard, that my mere presence was disrupting the peace. But each attempt to tarnish my reputation was met with swift failure. The new board, eager to distance themselves from Karen's toxic legacy, dismissed the complaints outright. Still, she persisted. And when the subtle attacks didn't work, she escalated. One morning, I woke up to find that someone had defaced my property. My front gate, once pristine, had been spray-painted with the words "Not welcome here." It was an ironic message, considering the neighborhood belonged more to me than it ever had to Karen. Security footage showed a figure sneaking onto my land in the dead of night, but the footage was grainy, the face obscured. I didn't need proof to know who was behind it. Karen had always relied on intimidation, but this was different. This wasn't just about pride anymore. This was personal. I tightened security, reinforced my surveillance, and kept my guard up, knowing that Karen was growing more desperate by the day. And then, just when I thought she couldn't go any lower, she made her final, desperate move. I received a letter in the mail, not from the HOA, but from a lawyer representing a group of concerned homeowners. The letter claimed that my property acquisitions had been conducted unfairly, that I had used my influence to seize control of the neighborhood, and that legal action was being pursued to challenge my ownership. It was a laughable claim, one built on nothing but speculation and bitterness, but I could see Karen's fingerprints all over it. She had rallied the last of her supporters, those who still clung to the old way of things, and was now trying to wage a legal war she had no hope of winning. She had no case. My purchases had been legal, my contracts airtight, and my influence undeniable. But Karen wasn't interested in winning. She wanted chaos. She wanted one final chance to prove that she still had power, that she could still make my life difficult, even if she had nothing left. She wanted a fight. And for the first time, I considered giving her one. But then, something unexpected happened. The very people Karen had counted on, the ones she had convinced to sign onto her ridiculous lawsuit, began to turn on her. Some had signed out of fear, others out of loyalty, but now, with her downfall public and her reputation in ruins, they were jumping ship. One by one, they retracted their support, some even coming to me directly to apologize. They had been tricked, manipulated, just as so many others had been before them. But this time, it hadn't worked. This time, Karen had pushed too far, and instead of solidifying her influence, she had destroyed it completely. The lawsuit fell apart before it even reached the courtroom. Karen, now abandoned by the very people she had ruled over, was left to fend for herself. I expected her to fight until the bitter end, to go down screaming and clawing, but when she realized that she had lost everyone, that no one was willing to stand beside her anymore, something inside her finally broke. She disappeared from public view, retreating into the shadows of the neighborhood she had once controlled. The last time I saw her, she was packing her things into a moving van, her face hollow and defeated. I stood at a distance, watching as she loaded the last of her belongings into the truck. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final exchange of words. Karen knew she had lost. She didn't need me to remind her. And so, without ceremony, she left, the woman who had once terrorized the neighborhood now nothing more than a cautionary tale. With her gone, the neighborhood began to change. The fear that had once loomed over the residents faded, replaced by something new, something better. The HOA, once a weapon used to control and intimidate, became what it was always meant to be, a tool for maintaining the community, not ruling over it. The people who had once been too afraid to stand up for themselves now had a voice, and for the first time in years, they were free to live without the constant threat of fines and arbitrary rules. As for me, I had won more than just a fight against Karen. I had secured something far greater: peace, control, and the assurance that no one would ever be able to take from me what was rightfully mine. Karen had tried to evict me, not realizing that she was the one who didn't belong. And in the end, she had done it to herself.